The wrong bet. That's what everyone's whispering about right now when they talk about what's happening between Iran and the West. Somewhere in Tel Aviv, somewhere in Washington, or maybe both places at once. Somebody convinced themselves they could topple Tehran's government from the outside. That gamble is how we got dragged into yet another Middle Eastern conflict, and it's also why things aren't exactly going according to plan right now. Before we go any further, make sure you're following this channel and hit that like button if you want to see more breakdowns like this. Your support keeps this analysis coming. There's actually a piece in the New York Times with sources close to the action that backs up this whole miscalculation theory. People are drawing parallels to how Moscow thought it could roll into Kiev and wrap things up in 72 hours. And honestly, it would make sense of the rumors floating around about potential negotiations happening quietly in Islamabad or somewhere nearby. We're going to spend considerable time today walking through why this interpretation actually holds water when you look at everything we've seen unfold. Don't worry, I'll make it clear with some visuals and everything. But here's the thing. One of the main pieces of evidence people keep pointing to as proof of this theory doesn't actually prove anything at all. The logical breakdown comes from the usual culprit, people fundamentally misunderstanding what actually causes wars to break out. Let's say it together. Bargaining failure. That's your answer right there. And it definitely isn't about whether the odds of street protests are high or low. So today, we're diving into the intelligence screw-up that might have pushed us into this conflict, and why the fact that we haven't seen regime change yet only weakly suggests there was a mistake in the first place. Let's dig into the alleged miscalculation first. Most of what we know factually comes from that Times piece I mentioned, though I'm going to add my own analytical caveats as we go. The big reveal is that David Barnea, the guy running Israel's Mossad, apparently thought the Iranian people could be stirred up to overthrow their own government within just days of military action starting. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu got behind this idea and then worked to sell Donald Trump on it. American intelligence wasn't nearly as convinced, and neither was the Pentagon. For reasons the reporting doesn't make totally clear, though we might be able to piece together why in a moment, Trump decided to go along with the plan anyway. The war hasn't delivered those results yet. This goes for both regular demonstrations in the streets and efforts to undermine Iranian security forces up in the northwest, to create space for more organized resistance from Kurdish fighters. Frustration is building now across the coalition. Netanyahu's annoyed with Mossad for feeding him bad intel. Trump's irritated with Netanyahu for pushing the war so hard. And maybe both of them are frustrated with potential protesters for not stepping up and taking risks on the ground. Kind of ironic considering Israel and America aren't exactly putting their own boots on the ground either. One theme that keeps coming up in the main reporting and elsewhere is that American intelligence kept producing gloomy forecasts about the whole situation. Yet Washington went to war anyway. Keep that detail in your back pocket as we continue. All right, that covers the meat of what's been reported. Now we need to shift gears into some theory so we can better make sense of what's happening. Right off the bat, anyone who's been watching this channel for a while will recognize this as a textbook private information bargaining problem. Let me break down the basics of this concept. If you're new to crisis bargaining theory, just know that I've got a comprehensive introduction to all this over on my other channel. Maybe check that out when you've got some time. Let's think of Iran's territory as representing the full scope of the political dispute between the Islamic Republic and Washington. It helps to picture the core problem this way, even though this isn't really a territorial conflict like what's happening in Ukraine. Splits toward the eastern side mean America gets closer to what it wants policy-wise, while splits toward the western side mean Iran gets closer to what it wants. In theory, there's an expected war outcome that takes everything that might happen during fighting and averages out all the random events that could occur during that time. Worth noting, this expected outcome factors in the possibility of protesters turning against the Iranian government. The more likely that uprising is, the further right we'd shift the expected outcome. That's because it'd be pretty tough for the current regime to enforce its preferred policies if it doesn't exist anymore. On the flip side, if the government can shut down protesters without breaking a sweat, the expected outcome slides further left. But war costs money and lives. Both the casualties and the economic resources burned through fighting. If you measure those physical losses against how much Iran values what's being fought over, the gap between the expected outcome line and this green line represents what war costs Iran. Now you'll notice everything to the right of the green line is what Iran expects to gain by fighting, minus what it costs them. We can run the same calculation for America. Its war costs go the opposite direction between the expected outcome line and the blue line. Everything left of the blue line is what Washington expects to gain minus its costs. When you add up what we've figured out so far, you'll see that any settlement between the blue and green lines makes both sides better off compared to war. That's because they're all near what war would produce anyway, but nobody pays the costs. We call this the bargaining range because the parties can negotiate somewhere in there. This logic immediately dismantles one of the narratives you'll hear about protests causing the war. According to the Times article, the White House launched this war because, ignoring what its own intelligence agencies were saying, it believed protesters would probably help the American cause. Therefore, Washington calculated that war would be worth it. And like that old saying goes, don't leave money on the table. Let me be absolutely direct about that argument. It doesn't make logical sense and lacks any strategic reasoning whatsoever. It makes the rounds because it sounds plausible on the surface. But once you actually try to trace the mechanism from the starting assumption to the conclusion, the whole thing collapses. You can be pessimistic about an outcome and still go to war. Remember, the expected outcome line already factors in the probability of protesters helping America. So the immediate consequence of a high protest probability is pushing that line to the right. But that just means the negotiated settlement should favor Washington accordingly. It doesn't mean war will happen. Likewise, a low protest probability just means the negotiated settlement should favor Iran. Whether someone rejects an offer is about what's actually on the table, not some isolated calculation about whether war will produce an objectively good or bad result. Put differently, what the protests cause war argument completely misses is that negotiating positions depend on war expectations. Both sides' positions should reflect what the underlying power balance actually is. Way too many arguments ignore this crucial point and end up falling apart because of it. I've literally got 2 sticky notes on my wall reminding me to write about other examples of this concept, if the world would just calm down for a hot minute. At least we're tackling one of those sticky notes today. That said, we can still connect protest incentives to why wars happen. We just need an extra assumption in the argument. One explanation is that the likelihood of successful protests was changing over time. That's actually pretty reasonable. But we've also covered that extensively over the past few weeks, so I don't want to rehash it again today. Another explanation that lines up with what's leaked from the White House is that there was a gap between American expectations and Iranian expectations. For instance, it makes sense to think the Iranian government better understood what was happening with protests in their country right before the war. They're the ones with security forces on the ground, giving them updates about what ordinary citizens are thinking. And while Washington gets some of that information too, it's going to be incomplete and blurred by both physical distance and limited regional knowledge. You could end up in a scenario where the Iranian government knows it's cracked down on protests harshly enough to break the spirit of all dissidents. Even with American backing, people won't be eager to hit the streets again. Meanwhile, the intelligence chatter coming out of Iran might be painting a rosier picture. Sure, the crackdowns pushed people back into their homes for now, but the underlying anger is still there and will explode if American intervention can handle some of the heavy lifting. To picture the problem, it's like Washington believes the bargaining range is over here. The intelligence community admits this assessment might be off, but it's their best estimate. In contrast, Iran knows the reality looks like this instead. As a result, America will demand a lot at the negotiating table, but Iran will dig in. That's how you get war. Private information creates a wedge between each side's expectations of what war will produce. Now, it's easy to criticize intelligence agencies for always being overly rosy about war prospects. And we certainly have another high-profile example of that logic playing out alongside the Iran situation. But that's a misleading takeaway because it overweights the more obvious cases. When intelligence agencies get it right, we don't see wars. After all, if both parties agree on the bargaining range, they should just hammer out an agreement. And I know this is tough to appreciate given the current chaotic state of the world, but most countries are at peace with most other countries most of the time. Intelligence failures like what I just described are the outliers. Plus, when intelligence agencies are unnecessarily gloomy, we also don't see wars. Here, America would show up to negotiations asking for very little. Iran would be somewhat confused about why Washington isn't acting more aggressive when Iran knows the situation is actually shaky. But Iran won't question its good fortune and will instead accept what's offered, which in this case is America conceding a lot. The only way we get war under these conditions is when the intelligence agency is too optimistic, and there's no way to verify that excessive optimism except by finding out on the battlefield. These are the cases that fill library shelves with history books, but I'm here as a social scientist to remind everyone that these aren't the typical cases. Moving forward, war as a result of uncertainty immediately reveals something important. The baseline expectation of protester success doesn't need to be high for war to break out here. I've been drawing the difference in expectations as huge because it helps illustrate the problem visually. In reality, what matters is how big the gap in state expectations is compared to how costly war is. For example, in this scenario, Washington is fairly pessimistic that the war will turn out well. However, Iran knows America should be even more pessimistic. This produces a war because Iran will be incredibly stubborn in negotiations. Washington won't ask for much at the table reflecting its own moderate pessimism, but Iran will still reject even those minimal requests. This is interesting because it's really hard for us as outsiders to judge whether a war is succeeding just by looking at the war outcome itself, or even leaked intelligence documents. For instance, it's easy to conclude that the Trump administration was dismissing the pessimistic reports from American intelligence, and instead acting unrealistically optimistic based on Israel's version of events. And maybe that's what happened. But you can't validly argue in support of that case by saying the war only makes sense under those conditions. That is, if the administration had listened to American intelligence, there's no way war could have happened. Not when American intelligence is pessimistic. Well, again, pessimism doesn't determine whether war happens or not. The gap in expectations between Washington and Tehran is what counts. Look, you'll hear me say constantly on this channel that I don't know things, or we don't know things. This isn't me dodging responsibility. I'd love to know things, but that's just not how international relations operates. It's a murky world out there. And especially in an era when misinformation is everywhere, and getting worse based on what I see on social media, including comments on my own videos, it's crucial to get our reasoning straight. That's why I'm here. Not to feed you partisan takes on the world, even though I have my own thoughts about these issues. And yes, I absolutely have opinions and personal biases that influence whether I think a politician is acting honestly or not. However, I don't discuss those because what I'm obsessed with is the logical validity of arguments. That's it. That's my job. I just want us to have better conversations about the political climate, because goodness knows that's challenging these days. Back to what we're talking about, to really drive home how difficult it is to assess who made the intelligence mistake. We could imagine an alternate reality where Iran was unduly optimistic about its odds, and America had the accurate intelligence picture. Wouldn't be the first time a country misjudged its own military strength. With the roles reversed, Now it's Iran showing up to negotiations asking for too much. Washington refuses, and war breaks out. Here, though, the expected war outcome will be objectively poor, regardless of whether Iran's assessment was right or America's assessment was right. For us sitting behind keyboards to judge whether the war was a smart move or not, we'd have to compare it to what was on the negotiating table. The war outcome by itself isn't particularly revealing because it lacks context. I'm raising this point because many articles discussing the intelligence situation muddle the logic here. They'll point to the absence of protests on the ground as definitive proof of a mistake to pull the trigger. They'll often claim that American intelligence said protests would happen, or Israeli intelligence reports said protests would happen, rather than acknowledging the uncertainty metrics that actual intelligence reports include. There's reason to think the Trump administration was pessimistic overall about uprising chances based on how it's messaging its war objectives. Apart from Trump's initial speech declaring war, regime change is a topic the administration tries to sidestep. And even in the war declaration, it was framed as a suggestion to the Iranian people rather than an explicitly stated goal. The reason you'd hedge like that if you were pessimistic about the prospects is that it would look politically bad if regime change is a stated objective that doesn't materialize. In contrast, if the administration were more optimistic, you could imagine regime change playing a much bigger public role to rally more backing for the cause. And they'd certainly like more backing right now, this being the most unpopular war launch in American polling history. A historical lens, which people at both the Pentagon and State Department are trained to use, also gave reasons to be skeptical overall going into the conflict. This strategy to trigger regime change has no previous example to build on. Interventions typically support existing rebellions. They don't usually try to spark one from scratch. We've been watching a very expensive experiment from the beginning. Regardless, what the media conversation doesn't emphasize enough is the comparison between American beliefs and Iranian beliefs, even though that's necessary for this mechanism to trigger war. As a final point, we should talk about the implications for ending the war. The typical analysis here also overlooks some of the nuances of bargaining failure. Let's start with the hopeful perspective. If war happens because of a mismatch in the two countries' expectations, then it'll end once those expectations have sufficiently aligned. At that stage, continuing to fight just imposes pointless costs on both sides. The encouraging thing here is that Washington can watch protest movements, or their absence. It can then adjust its understanding accordingly. Note that for this to cause the war to end, it actually has to be aligning previously mismatched expectations. If both parties share the same view of underlying protester dynamics, then any natural shifts over time there simply move the bargaining range around. They don't have a clear effect on removing bargaining obstacles. Well, yesterday it seemed there was some progress in trying to arrange negotiations for a ceasefire. To be clear, I don't have inside knowledge about what's happening there and whether any of this information is accurate. It's always entertaining when both sides say contradictory things, and even more entertaining when one side contradicts what it already said. However, if you accept that the war started because of excessive optimism from America, then it would make sense why the lack of protest movements on the ground is pushing the White House toward a diplomatic resolution. The intelligence agencies are starting to believe the initial forecasts were wrong, so it's time to lower demands accordingly. Still, the reporting on this front lacks some of the nuance that private information theory tells us. If we're in a world where Washington thought the daily odds of protests were unlikely, but Iran just thought they were even more unlikely, then the absence of protests so far reveals little about which view was correct. To make that idea more concrete, imagine if you didn't know whether there was a 0% chance that a meteor would wipe out all life on Earth on any given day, or a 0.011% chance. Then waking up alive and healthy tomorrow would make you slightly more confident, but not much. Well, it's the same principle with Iran, just not quite as extreme. That's why I'm paying closer attention to news about updated American intel assessments on the probability of protest movements starting. The intelligence community is looking beyond just the lack of protests so far. It's also gathering information on the underlying potential. In other words, they'll figure this out well before we see the reality play out publicly. And if they start growing more pessimistic, matching what Iranian expectations perhaps were at the beginning, then yes, I think the war will end sooner rather than later. Again, sooner rather than later, not tomorrow. Given that its military forces are already deployed, Washington will want to hang around a bit longer to keep sabotaging Iran's production capabilities. But that's about it. So what have we figured out? There's some evidence America was overly optimistic in evaluating protesters going into the war. The media confuses general optimism as causing war rather than a divergence in expectations between the parties. This might be shaping how the media reports on the intelligence assessments, but if the excessive optimism story is accurate, then the war might end soon. Meanwhile, it looks like my work just keeps going. Day 25 straight is done. While you wait for day 26, why not watch this video if you want the complete introduction to crisis bargaining theory? And if you got something out of today's video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll catch you next time. Take care.